Live. Today I have the pleasure of Yvonne Guerineau. Good morning to you, Yvonne.
Good morning. Lovely to see you, Julian.
Good to see you. You are a consultant, coach, trainer, facilitator, amongst the many things that you do. But you love discovering all you can about people, who they are, how they behave, and why. And your speciality is observing, supporting, and resolving the challenges that arise when working relationships aren't at their very best. You're also the author of People in Their Element, How to Create Positive Working Relationships. And no surprising, we're going to be exploring how to get people in their element in a workplace, looking at positive work relationships and sort of that sort of aspect to create results. But before we get into that, Yvonne, what would you like? What do you love about what you do?
What I love about what I do, thank you for the introductions. It does make me sound very multifaceted. Do you know what I love is connecting with real people. I do everything tech-free wherever possible. So in the room, I like people to look each other in the eye, and something magical happens, I think, when people really connect with each other. And I love being able to create that for myself, for other people, for a whole room full of people. Just that sense of we are people in the presence of other people, and how to get the magic out of that, which is why I call myself an alchemist. And we talk about putting people in their element, which I'm sure you'll get into in more detail as well.
Fantastic. There's something magical about people being in the room, isn't it? And no tech and just being present amongst each other, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, we are social animals. We like to be around people. We feel lonely when we're not around people, or actually we can be lonely with people if we don't feel that sense of connection. And there's something magical. And I know it's science that why it happens, and the biology and the neuroscience behind it. But it also feels a bit magical, that moment when you just connect and you go, oh, they get me, or I feel understood, or I feel heard, or I'm being seen by someone. That for me is where science and magic collide, and that makes it quite special, I think.
Yes, no, I love seeing that when I'm facilitating groups, and you see that sort of the realization where somebody just suddenly, as you say, feels heard, or actually gets somebody because they've explained something they've never heard before, and you've given that sort of space to do that, and it's wonderful. So we are talking about people in their element, and I love that because that's a phrase that people do, don't they? Say that get in your elements into who you are and all that sort of stuff. So from your perspective, what does people in their element actually look like in the workplace?
So people in their element for me is that moment when it's really hard. People have different descriptions for it, but that's that sense of I'm on fire, like I'm doing what I'm meant to be doing. I'm being who I am. I'm at my best. I'm functioning without boundaries. I am doing something that feels positive and energizing, and not necessarily because you're rushing around in a happy kind of jumping way. It can be deep into a spreadsheet, or it can be really problem solving something super tricky and finding your way through it, knowing that problem solving is your bag. It's that sense of, some people refer to it as being in flow. I think it's not necessarily always being in flow, but it's that being true to yourself. It feels authentic, I think, being able to be authentic.
And is it when people sort of get clarity of their purpose, and it's that alignment with what they're doing with their purpose? Would you say that's part of it?
I think maybe. I mean, not everybody necessarily always knows what their purpose is, but there's a sense of an alignment with yourself. So the activity I think that you're doing on the outside aligns with the person you are on the inside. So you can be in your element running through a field. It doesn't necessarily have a purpose of crossing a field, but maybe your purpose is connecting with nature, and that in that moment you're in that kind of in your element. I mean, I had it this week. I mean, we talked about it in the introduction before we came on. Not even this week, but last week, I did my first exhibition stand, and 4 hours went by, and I thought, wow, I was just really true to myself. I said what I wanted to say. I presented myself the way I wanted to present to myself. I had really powerful conversations, which is important to me. I came out of that and I thought I was so in my element. I was just positive and energized by it. It was a really good place to be. And I think when you come out of that moment in a work context, it's whatever it is you're doing, and you think, yes, I could do this all day, every day. that's the moment. And I think there's something authentic in that.
That's fantastic. No, it's a great phrase, and it's great to sort of hear that you were in your elements in that sort of context as well, which is what you love doing, engaging with people.
Yeah.
And in your experience, whether in what you do now or in your previous sort of career, what was the most sort of common barriers preventing people from finding being in their element?
I think mostly it's about expectations. Either they have expectations of themselves of how they should behave. You often hear the phrase about the corporate environment, living the corporate life, being something you think you're supposed to be. Sometimes it's fear of judgment, I think. People assume that if you're going to be good at this job, there's a certain way to do it, or your boss has expectations, rightly or wrongly. I mean, you might not know whether this is accurate, but you may think they have certain expectations of you, and living up to those expectations. We want to please people. We don't want to disappoint. We don't want to let them down or ourselves down. So we filter and we manage how we show up. So what you're left with is kind of it's like a broken kind of image of who we are. So we're not completely in our element, we're a managed version. And I think that's that fear that often sits behind it, I think, is what stops that from happening. And then, of course, if you are misunderstood and you've had bad experiences, then you will again clip yourself. You will hold back from saying certain things, doing certain things. Yeah, it's hard to articulate, which is why I say it 10 times over in different directions. But essentially, the problem is people aren't sure it's okay, that they'll be allowed to, that they're going to be getting away with it or happy, or that it's allowed.
There's obviously multiple factors going on there, isn't there, in terms of,
Yeah.
I mean, in that sort of sometimes being yourself, sometimes it can be that you don't feel psychologically safe with the environment to be yourself. And sometimes it could be perhaps people don't know themselves, like, in terms of the self-awareness. What have you found that's helpful to try and unlock that people being in their element and doing what they're sort of called to be, authentic themselves, that type of thing?
I think you're absolutely right about the psychological safety, and I know it's something you and I both feel quite strongly about, that we need to have that. How do you unlock it? I think one, you have to create that safety. But what I find creates that safety when I'm in a room with people is normalizing the feelings, normalizing the behavior. So I work with a personality profiling tool. I find that helps me. I don't think that's necessarily right for everyone, but it helps me when I say that this behavior would be quite common for someone who has this kind of profile, or for someone who has this kind of profile or preference. This would be what they might be thinking or how they might be feeling, because this is likely to be their priority. The minute I normalize that, the minute I say that actually it's quite common to feel like this, someone in the room who may have self-managed, self-criticized that this might not be appropriate will suddenly think, oh, I'm allowed that, that's normal, I'm okay.
Mm.
And the minute you do that, it invites other people to do the same. So in normalizing behavior, in normalizing ways of thinking, in normalizing perspective, saying it's okay, it invites others to step into that space. So that's how I approach it. I'm sure there's other ways that you've come across. I know you speak to a lot of different people who approach things in different ways. That's what I find works for me.
And how can you translate that if a lot of leaders listen to this podcast right now,
Mm.
and they may be thinking, do you know what, I really want my team to be in their element, because if they're doing something they love and they're engaged, then
Mm.
my performance of my team will be better. Clearly, they'll be
Yeah.
aligned with that. So
Yeah.
what sort of things could a leader be doing, thinking about?
One of the biggest things is exactly how we started the conversation, which is about this human connection thing. The better you know people, the more time you invest in understanding who they are, why they do things, what they love, what lights them up, what their fears are in terms of their progression or their capabilities. The closer you get to know them, the more time you invest, the easier it is to make it okay and to say, I like that about you, I value that about you. Please bring that to the team meeting, and to actually catch them doing those things and acknowledge that positively. So if you do something that you would like to do more of, and I know that, and I see you do it, and I go, gosh, it was great to see you do that. I really loved the way you engaged. That reinforces that message of it's normal, it's okay, do more of it. but you have to invest the time and the energy to get to know someone to be able to bring that out. So as a leader, unfortunately, the message is put energy and time in, which doesn't always land well because time is a scarce resource. There's only so much of it in a day. But yes, the more you want to bring someone out, the more you have to go and meet them there and invite them out, I think.
And what do you think about the leader who might talk about normalizing things? And do you think the role of a leader has, in a context of a meeting, perhaps, a way of role modeling aspects to normalize conversation, normalize ways of thinking as part of that process as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you have a tendency to speak up, it's okay to sit back and say, actually, I'm going to take some time to think about that, and to make it normal to have time to think about that, in the same way they might normalize being the person who stands up and speaks out. I mean, I did have a leader recently I worked with who just couldn't get people to buy into something. And I said, well, the problem is you're pushing, aren't you? And I actually held my hand up, and those who are listening on this won't be able to see this, but if I held my hand up to you and I said, would you, reach out and hold your hand against mine? If I then start pushing you, your instinct is to push back, because if I push you, you have a natural inclination to resist my push. Whereas if I just hold my hand steady, then you can hold your hand steady. So what I said to this leader is stop pushing, create that space, make it normal not to push, make it normal to give people space. And that might mean time, that might mean silence. It's whatever the person needs. Say it's okay that you need that. Say it's okay that you want that. And if someone in the room pushes someone else, to actually say, no, don't push that person, please. That person would like a bit more time, and that's okay. Not to encourage the pusher and push along with them. So sometimes it's about acknowledging other people's needs in public, so they can hear that you find everybody's approach acceptable and everybody's welcome here.
I like that idea. That's a good way of using it as a good learning tool in a context of a meeting, with sort of acknowledging things and sharing things, but also it shows real support and value for the different perspectives you have in the room as well.
And the more you show that you value it, the more others will value it, because leaders lead, and people will look at what you do. And if you say, actually, it's okay to sit quietly and come back with an answer later, then everyone in the room will think, oh, it's okay to sit quietly and come back with the answer later because you've made it okay. But if you don't, then people will question whether it's okay.
Yeah, because I think that the biggest, I suppose, impact a leader can have or be aware of is the role modeling aspect. Actually, people look at you, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, get a sense of what they can do based on how you're acting, how you're doing things, what you're saying, how you're going about things. You talked about human connection before and how that's a sort of really important in developing that human connection.
Yeah.
Which sounds really obvious, doesn't it, to create human connection? But what gets in the way, from your experience of organisations you've worked with, of creating that human connection? I feel weird asking that question, but I think it's an important thing to ask, because I think stuff does get in the way.
Yeah, it's one of those throwaway comments, isn't it? People say, well, you just need to connect with people, but that seems a bit more difficult for some people than it does for others. For me, it's noticing little things and picking up on them. So physically looking someone in the eye when you're speaking to them, or acknowledging what they say. If anybody ever follows anything about personal relationships, the Gottman Institute are quite a big name in this area. They talk about responding to people by leaning in or acknowledging what they say. So if, for example, I said to you, I had a really bad day this morning. If you go, oh, right, and carry on the conversation, I don't feel heard. If you say, oh, you had a bad morning, immediately there's a connection. I spoke, you acknowledged. The acknowledgement, even if we never go any deeper into it, I spoke and you responded to me, that is a connection. It doesn't have to be that much more complicated. The problem is often leaders will come into a meeting with an agenda and a timetable and time restrictions, and someone says something and they go, yeah, and then they move on. And it's not because they don't care, it's because they know they have to move on. Whereas in that one moment that somebody said something, if you go, yeah, that's really interesting, thank you. can we pick it up later? Because we need to get moving with this, but I have heard you. That moment is a connection that says you're present, I'm present, we're in it together. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be acknowledgement. And sometimes an acknowledgement that you park, but still an acknowledgement. The minute you change the subject or do something different, you are turning away from somebody, and that is disconnection.
Interesting.
Does that answer your question,
No,
Julian?
no. It's interesting because when we talked about trying to create sort of a human psychological safety, talked about acknowledging and normalizing things, and that's quite a powerful thing just to acknowledge, isn't it? Where you show the empathy of a situation, but you don't have to go into detail. And it goes back to that humans value being valued, don't they? That's and being heard. And it, again, very obvious stuff. But it's really important that people feel that, and it comes about feeling. And I think people forget we are feeling human beings. We do feel stuff.
Yeah, so many people think it's all about what's going on in our head, but the reality is we're very emotionally driven. Fear is our biggest, trigger of action, really, to keep you alive. But there's something that happens when I acknowledge what you say. So even in this conversation, you picking up on the language I use or coming back to something we talked about initially, these are all signs of connection because I hear you and you hear me and we pick up on words that we use, and it means you're engaged. And this is what I'm talking about when I say creating connection. Empathy can be a big word. People are like, well, I'm showing empathy, but the other person might not be feeling it. The minute you connect, the minute you hear the word, repeat the word back, acknowledge the sentence that's been said, something clicks, because it's like the two pieces have come together. I spoke, you heard. I acknowledge that I heard that you spoke. Now we're in it together. And that being in it together is the bit that I mean about connection.
And what other ways, I'm building on that, can we do to create that human connection with our team and our people around us?
I mean, I'm a big fan of quality time. I think being in the presence of things come out of the woodwork. So I'm a big fan of being in the room. I appreciate not every environment naturally has that opportunity all the time. There's a lot more virtual working. I have quite a strong view on you do need to be in the position to see people eyeball to eyeball. So I think spending time, if you can't do it physically, at least visually spend time, or in an auditory sense, spend time on the phone together. Because the more time you spend, the more airspace there is for someone to drop something important into the gap. I don't know if you've ever had this, but I have a child, and when you have children, often you notice that when you're quiet, like you're driving and they're in the back of the car, interesting stuff comes up in conversation that wouldn't come up normally. So standing side by side to someone, having coffee. This is why water cooler conversations have got this reputation of bringing all kinds of stuff out of the woodwork. It's because there's no agenda. And when there's no agenda and there's space, people fill it. And often really important things come out on a dog walk, walking between one building and the next, when you're waiting for a machine to chuck something out. That's when interesting things happen. And the only way you can do that is to create enough time for that to happen, and ideally in person.
And how do we create that it's not forced or planned? Because in some ways, some of those moments are slightly impromptu, aren't they? Those water cooler moments. And I know when I used to work in an office, and I used to want purpose. This is more intentional. I intentionally walked the floor, so to speak, because, and I went through every department, and I was in sales. I was nothing to do. Sometimes I was just connecting with people, being present, and all sorts of things would get taught. I heard all sorts of things going on, but I'd be building relationships through that.
Yes.
There was a bit of an intention of me just, walking around people, but genuinely listening to what people said and all that type of thing.
Yeah.
How can we do it that it feels authentic, but also take the moments of that connection opportunity?
I mean, honestly, there's really good little tips for how to make this work, especially if it doesn't feel natural to you to walk the building like you've just described. Some people will go, that sounds awful. I'd feel really staged and it would feel really uncomfortable. But I had a client years ago who had exactly this challenge, wanted to be more open, said, I have an open door policy, but no one came. And I said, well, less of the open door, more of the get out of your office, honestly. And I said something like, well, why don't you park your car further back in the car park so you have to walk past everyone on the way in? And if you park at the back instead of at the front, then you have to go across the shop floor to get to your office, which means you naturally have to pass everyone. So you've immediately created a scenario where it opens up the opportunity without you having to physically leave your office and walk out in some staged way. Once that's been created, now you can spark conversation, where you can spark conversation on topics that other people won't find awkward. So if you prepare the night before and you know what's happening on the shop floor, you can comment on how great productivity was yesterday and say, oh, how's it going with this new piece of equipment? Or you can say, oh, I see you signed up for something that you read on the notice board. I didn't realize you were a runner. So you can comment on things that are not overly personal, and you don't have to create fake chit chat. You can use real life information that's data about production or data about work or the fact that they've signed up for something and it's on the notice board. Nothing that's really overly personal or private, but that you can in passing say, oh, I saw this or I heard that, and let people talk. And once you make a habit of it, people will begin, like you said about psychological safety, people will begin to think, oh, there he comes again, or there she is on her walk through. If she stops this time, I might mention this, because the conversation's already moving. So it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen just because you once walk out to the office and you're visible. You have to make a habit of it, and you have to say, I'm open for conversation, and then people will step into it. But yeah, I mean, one of my biggest challenges is I hate the whole idea of the open door policy, because I wouldn't walk through any old random open door just because the door was open. It just wouldn't happen. But if I thought someone genuinely wanted to talk to me because they already talk to me every day, if I had something personal and I saw them every day and we had nice conversations, then I might venture to their office if their door was open.
Yeah, and it's little micro conversations, isn't it? It can be just building that little touch point of insights. And I found it just going round. I used to do it at least once a week, and it just helped on many occasions of getting things done. And they'd come to me about issues and challenges on the sales team, so people felt they could approach me, and it just was incredibly invaluable. And I quite enjoyed it as well. So I got to hear
and
about
you
all
find
sorts of
out
things going on.
things.
Yeah,
And
you
you
do.
find out things because you happen to be passing as the conversation's going on. And if they're used to you coming past, they won't stop the conversation because you're coming past. And then you find out who's got what on their mind and who's late every morning because they've got issues that they're trying to solve, and how you can help. It's very useful. And I think this is what we've lost a little bit with virtual life. And it's not that you can't have both, but this is how often the connection is lost if people don't have what you've just described.
And thinking about our new world we're in with hybrid and virtual and all sorts of things, and people looking at screens a lot. What are your thoughts on creating human connection in that sort of context? What have you found that's been really helpful and useful that you've done or you've observed with the companies you've worked with?
I think building in buffers helps. So time buffers either end of meetings so that there's room to run over if you need to. I know that sounds like a big ask for people who are running back to back from meeting to meeting to meeting, but I'm not sure that's healthy. So building buffers in, I think, is a good thing. Creating opportunities one-to-one. So if you're always putting the group together, so if you're meeting virtually all the time and you're always 5 or 6 in the meeting room, opportunities to see people individually is going to be important, because some people will never share in a group, but they won't necessarily advertise that they want a private conversation. So you have to offer it, and you have to make that a real thing. I think encouraging anything that you do together, if you can only get together once a year or twice a year in person, use the time well. Don't just have the same meeting again, but physically in a room. Use it to do something that connects you, whether it's the sort of workshop I run, or getting somebody in to do something entertaining, or doing an activity. It's completely off-piste and nothing to do with what you normally do, or motivational something. anything that changes the topic of conversation so you can get to know people on a more personal level. Anything like that is useful.
And how can we, I mean, it sounds really another obvious sort of question, get people to see the benefits of, it feels in some ways slowing down and just giving a bit more time to building connections with people, which sounds really obvious. But how can we get people to see the benefits, or almost see what are the consequences for not doing this?
I mean, I can't quote it now, but there's so much research about how much better you function if you've had a proper break. And that you're much more productive after a walk than you are if you plow on regardless. You can't really explain that to someone until they've experienced it. But we all talk about turning it off and turning it on again. And I think with people, it's exactly the same. You have to turn it off and turn it on again sometimes to restart the system. I think the real benefits are that if you take time out and you rest and you have a break, the world just looks different. Like, I mean, I'm a puzzler. You can stare at the thing over and over again, walk away for half an hour, and all the pieces that were lying there suddenly fit together. It's amazing how that happens. Or the thoughts that come to you in the shower because you haven't got your phone with you. Well, I hope not, but you haven't got your phone with you, and you can't possibly be doing anything else other than being in the shower. So you have this great idea. And that's the evidence you need. So anyone who's on the fence thinking, oh, I don't know, these rest things don't work. I mean, honestly, just have more showers, because at least then you are going to have to switch yourself off. And if you can't get yourself out for a walk and you can't build these buffers into your day, then fine, just be overly hygienic, because at least then you're switching yourself off.
I like that. But put in showers instead of going for a walk. Yeah, that's interesting.
If it works for you. I mean, if that's the only way that you can get yourself to switch off and you can notice the benefits of it, then do that. But it's normally having to do something that makes you stop. If you go out and you're still listening to things and doing things and you're walking around on your phone, you're not going to get the benefit. You have to properly switch off. And for some people, getting in the shower is the only option, which is why they have great ideas in the shower, because that's the only time they switch off.
Yes, absolutely. Now, we talked about that, sort of having that time with people, one-to-one time and everything else. That, and sometimes in an organization can become a bit of a tick box. We have our one-to-ones every week type of thing, and all the team.
Yeah.
How can we make those sessions, meetings, time together really healthy and productive in a context of building that human connection?
It's really interesting. I had this conversation with a client quite recently about how to make their one-to-ones really work. And what I said is, well, do you even know what they want out of a one-to-one? And the answer was really interesting. It's like, well, I'm sure it's because of this and that. And then we created this form. And I said, yeah, but what are they really? If you said to them it was a good one, what would they say made it good? And the answer is different people, different things. Like some people, they just want to know that they're on the right track. They want you to say, yes, that's the right priority. Yes, I like what you're doing. Carry on. That's all the reassurance they need, and they're off. They feel heard in that moment, and they feel that you care about what's on their plate. Somebody else wants to bounce ideas around with you. They want that time to say what they're thinking, to share what's on their mind. They don't want to go through the to-do list. They can do that on their own. They want your input. They want your ideas. They want your energy. They want you to pick them up when they're having a bad day, so that they feel that you're holding space for them. Some people just want to know that you are present, that you will give them some opportunity to reflect with them. Everything they will want out of that session will be different to the person who wants to bounce ideas around. And I think the simple question of what would make this one-to-one good for you might be all that it takes, and to be willing to give everybody what they need. Now, if you're going into the one-to-one thinking, well, this is what it's for and this is what I need out of it, then maybe you're not using it for them. Maybe you're using it for you. And you also have to get clear on that. Is this one-to-one for them? Or is this one-to-one for you? Or is it half-half? In which case, are you getting your half and are they getting their half? But I think clarity on what the point is got to be high on the agenda. And if it is supposed to be their time, then give them that time. Don't use it for you, to give them instructions and tell them what you want, and give them feedback on what you think they're doing well. You get them to use the time for them. So yeah, I think get your head around what the point is. If you're going to tick the box just to have one, then you're missing out, because that time could be so much better spent.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think often people see one-to-ones or the leaders, it's their time to tell them, inform them things. And that may be part of it, but actually, I've always said the one-to-ones for the individual. And it is there is for them really, and work out what works for them and best for them. I always say to a lot of leaders, but also get used to being just present, shutting your mouth and listening.
Yes.
Because you'd be surprised how powerful the tool of silence gets people talking and sharing, and that's all it takes. Just people just to listen, and then actually you'll get so far more out of it than you ever before.
Yeah, and even like we said earlier on about this creating safe space and connection, if the meeting starts or the one-to-one starts, so the person says, oh, well, it's nothing important at the moment, just acknowledging the word important and going, oh, so there's nothing important at the moment. What makes you say there's nothing important? And just holding that, because whatever word they used it for a reason, even if they don't know the reason. And important is a judgment word. They're judging whether this is a priority, not a priority, whether it's important or not important. They're not saying it's relevant, they're saying it's important. So there's something behind it. So if you brush over it, you've missed it. And like you rightly said, if you hold that space, then they will tell you why they think that. And it may be actually that you disagree, and it's an opportunity then to come into that space. But most people find that silence hard, really hard. And I think building silence resilience is something I wrote in my newsletter quite recently. And I got some interesting feedback from people about it, because you do have to be quite resilient to sit out of silence. It's not easy sitting out of silence.
No, it's not at all. People love to talk. Fill the gap, definitely.
And those who really love it come on podcasts and talk a lot, like me.
No,
Silence is hard. It is hard.
It is hard. Yes, but yeah, and so yeah, thank you for coming on. I've really enjoyed that conversation. I think it's highlighted how important human connection really is, and I think you've given some great sort of insights and tips to help leaders who are listening right now. If people want to connect with you, Yvonne, and get to know you, what's the best way of doing that?
So I'm on LinkedIn quite a lot, and I'm on Instagram. So you can find me with a name search. The Guerineau is a bit tricky, but you can look for Golden Catalyst, which is the other way to find me. I've got a website, which is goldencatalyst.co.uk. And I have a newsletter, which is a really good way to kind of keep in touch with the things I'm doing and what I'm about. So yeah, all those ways are the best way to find me.
Excellent. And we'll leave all those links into the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time today, Yvonne.
Yeah, and thank you for drawing all that out. That was a really great conversation.